Laurence Gardner claims Joseph went to Egypt not in the early 18th century BC, but in the early 15th century BC. His version of Akhenaton, Moses' story is very consistent and logical. This is a brief summary of his version of the story. Tuthmosis IV, ruled 1413 to 1405 BC, had a vizier Yuya, believed to be biblical Joseph. When Pharaoh Tuthmosis died, his son married his sibling sister Sitaman, as was the Pharaonic tradition, so that he could inherit the throne as Pharaoh Amenhotep III. Shortly afterwards he also married Tiye, daughter of the chief minister, Joseph, Yuya. It was decreed, however, that no son born to Tiye could inherit the throne. Because of the overall length of her father Joseph's governorship, there was a general fear that the Israelites were gaining too much power in Egypt. So when Tiye became pregnant, the edict was given that her child should be killed at birth if a son. Tiye's Jewish relatives lived at Goshen, and she herself owned a summer palace a little upstream at Zaron, where she went to have her baby. She did indeed bear a son, but the royal midwives conspired with Tiye to float the child downstream in a reed basket to the house of her father's half-brother Levi. The boy, Aminadab, born around 1394 BC, was duly educated in the eastern Delta country by the Egyptian priests of Ra. In his teenage years he went to live at Thebes. By that time, his mother had acquired more influence than the senior queen, Sitaman, who had never borne a son and heir to the pharaoh, only a daughter who was called Nefertiti. In Thebes, Aminadab could not accept the Egyptian deities and their myriad idols, and so he introduced the notion of Aten, an omnipotent god who had no image. Aten was thus an equivalent of the Hebrew Adonai, a title borrowed from the Phoenician and meaning Lord, in line with Israelite teachings. At that time Aminadab, Hebrew equivalent of Amenhotep Amun is pleased, changed his name to Akhenaten, servant of Aten. Pharaoh Amenhotep then suffered a period of ill health. Because there was no direct male heir to the royal house, Akhenaten married his half-sister Nefertiti in order to rule as co-regent during this difficult time. When in due course Amenhotep III died, Akhenaten was able to succeed as pharaoh, officially called Amenhotep IV. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters and a son, Tuthmosis. Pharaoh Akhenaten closed all the temples of the Egyptian gods and built new temples to Aten. He also ran a household that was distinctly domestic, quite different from the kingly norm in ancient Egypt. On many fronts he became unpopular, particularly with the priests of the former national deity Amun, or Amen, and of the sun god Ra, or Re. Plots against his life proliferated. Loud were the threats of armed insurrection if he did not allow the traditional gods to be worshipped alongside the faceless Aten. But Akhenaten refused, and was eventually forced to abdicate in short-term favor of his cousin Smenkhare, who was succeeded by Akhenaten's son Tuthmosis. On taking the throne at the age of about 11, Tuthmosis was obliged to change his name to Tutankhamun. He, in turn, was only to live and rule for a further 9 or 10 years, meeting his death while still comparatively young. Akhenaten, meanwhile, was banished from Egypt. He fled with some retainers to the remote safety of Sinai, taking with him his royal scepter topped with a brass serpent. To his supporters he remained very much the rightful monarch, the heir to the throne from which he had been ousted, and he was still regarded by them as the Moses or Moses, heir born of, as in Tuthmosis, born of Tuth, and Ramesses, fashioned of Ra. Evidence from Egypt indicates that Moses, Akhenaten, led his people from Pi-Ramesses, near modern Kantra, southward, through Sinai, towards Lake Timash. This was extremely marshy territory and, although manageable on foot with some difficulty, any pursuing horses and chariots would have foundered disastrously. The above summary was from Laurence Gardner, a wise Gnostic. This version of the story makes more sense than official versions. This explains how Moses was in fact a royal house member, yet a second order to the royal house. Also this explains how he is in fact also Jewish but cannot speak Hebrew. Also in Akhenaten's life he was neither very accepted by Jews nor Egyptians. His revolution was accepted generations later.